Welcome to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. Hey, on the show, we've got a man who is somewhat famous to my sons. He hosts the Haunted Cosmos podcast with his friend Ben. He's out in Ogden, Utah. He is the minstrel of Ogden, Utah. And so I'm glad to have Brian Sauvé on the show today. And Brian, just right off the bat, did I pronounce your last name correctly just then?
You were so close that it was... The way that, here's how the boys in Ogden explain it to people, which I hate the way they explain it, but it is the most memorable and easy to remember. And so I've started using it, and it's Brian Sauvé, like so gay. It's so helpful. And, you know, I just feel the camaraderie and respect that we have for each other here in Ogden amongst our team. Yeah. Sauvé, c'est français. It means saved in French. It's actually kind of a cool name, but yeah, I answer to Sauvé, shampoo, Sauve, Suave, Sauve, pretty much any of it.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that with our audience today.
The principle is cancel yourself and then you're uncancelable. Just say Sauvé like so gay, and then what can they do to you? What can they do?
Nothing. Well, I wanted to get into kind of your story on the show today because you know, you guys have a lot of stuff cooking out there in Ogden. You're pastors, you're at a local church, but you've also got kind of new Christendom Press. You've got Eric Kahn out there doing some podcast stuff on masculinity. And if you're a listener, I've been on that show. Matt's been on that show, Matt Patrick. And so you got a lot of stuff going on, but I kind of wanted to take a step back from that and just hear more of your story, how you got into ministry. So I guess my first question would be, you know, I believe you're in your 30s, have some kids. Yep. How did you get into ministry? What was that like for you?
Yeah, so I am in my 30s, and my wife Lexi and I, we have 6 kids so far, from 10 on down to about 6 months. And I've been in ministry for longer than I should have been able to be in ministry, given my age, mainly due to the absolutely insane world of Christian culture that is the 90s to 2020s here. So I grew up in a pretty mega church environment. My family was Air Force, so we moved quite a bit growing up. But my dad retired. We moved from London, England to Ogden, Utah, like Layton, Utah, in the late 90s. And then my dad ended up retiring from the Air Force here. So I was in about 3rd grade at that point and have basically grown up in Utah. Almost most of that time, other than at Refuge that I pastor now, was at the same church that was kind of a non-denomination. It was in a denomination, but we didn't talk about it. Kind of Baptist church there. Started pretty traditional when I was there, had a choir. Then they had like the choir and the contemporary service. And then they had the choir and the contemporary service, and then this is where I came in. They asked the youth group worship leader, hey, we want to start a really hip night service for the adults. Nice. And we want you to lead. I had like shoulder length hair, Led Zeppelin t-shirt. Could not have explained to you virtually any aspect of systematic theology. And I started leading worship for that night service, went on staff with that church, led worship for some years. And during that period in my high school years, I did begin to at least sense an inward call to ministry. I think I should not worship ministry, but preaching, pastoral ministry. So I had at that point started to just point my life that way. I started studying, trying to figure out, you know, theological, pastoral theology, that kind of thing. And it was at that point I think I was about 17, that maybe 18. Lexi and I had been dating, now my now wife, and we just said we want to see if there's anything else out there other than kind of this church world that we're familiar with. So we started attending this little church plant in a living room in Ogden on the east bench of the mountain in Ogden, and it was a Calvary Chapel church plant led by one of our former youth leaders named Jeremy. And that was like our first introduction to expository preaching. And this idea that you could do serial exposition through a whole book of the Bible. it was like, this is a great idea. Why has no one done this before?
Sure.
They were like, well, it's been done, believe it or not. So we started helping out with that church plant, got really involved there. Eventually, I worked in the morning. I would lead worship for that church plant. And then in the evening, I'd lead worship for the cool service. And in the middle, I was a janitor at the mega church. And so I would flip all of the chairs to these cool round tables for the service. And that was our first. We eventually ended up going whole hog and saying we're gonna join this church plant, help out. I went through pastoral training there for a few years and ordination there. Went to Calvary Chapel Bible College, and that church is the church I pastor now.
Okay.
That was Refuge Church. I did not plant or name the church. I'm always threatening to change the name of the church to something less cool. And so long story short, what happened at that church was that the planting pastor, this was not the youth leader, Jeremy, that had been kind of the doorway for us into the church, but the lead pastor, the planting pastor, had been mentoring me with the aim of church planting in like 3 to 5 years, which is crazy because I was 20. But that was the culture back then. It was like the heyday of Mark. It was the high watermark of Mark Driscoll. As you're probably, I don't know if you've heard of him before.
No, never. Who?
yeah, Mr. Driscoll. When I was a janitor, I listened to probably 40 to 60 days of Mark Driscoll preaching in my iTunes library.
And you were just super pumped and angry afterwards, just every day, just full of life.
I'd be waxing that floor, just enraged with these young men who were sleeping with their girlfriends. I was like, how dare you? Who the hell? So at that point, things were going really well. Learning a lot about counseling and ministry and kind of neck deep, growing church, lot dynamic church, a lot of new Christians who were, being saved. And at that point, the lead pastor committed adultery. And so he was disqualified. All of a sudden, we have this young elder team. He was the oldest, removed him. And then the other guy took over for about 2 years, but he was not a guy that really wanted to be a lead pastor or preaching pastor. So maybe, I think I was 24 at this point, somewhere around 24. And that guy, Jeremy, said, hey, come over tonight. I want to talk to you. And it's like, I think I'm called to the mission field. I'm going to Eastern Europe. I think you're supposed to take over the church. So I was like, all right, let's talk about that. That's eventually what happened. And so I started pastoring the church. And then everything between that point and today is just one long, painful, crazy, unscripted journey of church reformation from an Arminian dispensational Calvary Chapel. Calvary Chapel, I really don't want to dunk on them. I mean, they love exposition of the scriptures. They get the gospel right. I think they're going in a lot of directions lately that I would not be excited about. But I received a huge blessing from Calvary Chapel in coming out of my megachurch kind of upbringing into that. So the eight plus years in between that moment and where we are today, it was just one big preach, literally, almost literally everybody out of the church, several hundred people out of the church.
Wow.
Oh, not all at once, but then a whole new church in, and now we are dual practiced, Paedo-Baptist. We're Calvinist. I teach the Westminster Confession of Faith line by line in Sunday school recently, just singing 4-part harmony psalms with a piano, and I conduct. I no longer play the guitar on Sunday. People always ask me, Brian, how do you lead this setting of yours in the congregation? And I say, here's the neat thing. You don't. You get a Cantus Christi.
Right.
You sing
Which are sold out right now on Canon Press.
It's
so
because
I can't
of us.
Get one. Yeah.
Every time they open the sale, we buy like 300 of them day
I
one.
hate you.
So yeah, it's our fault. We're not. In fact, I'm actually so abundant is our wealth. I'm using one to hold up my microphone right
They're just office equipment
Oh,
now.
that's just rude.
That's amazing.
Oh, that's like in between all of that. Of course, my wife and I got married when we were 19 and 20. We started having children in the midst of all of this craziness. So we feel like the years of ministry that we've been through have been just experiencing just about everything that you can experience that should happen in 80 years
Yeah.
in about 10.
Yeah.
And just a wild ride. So for the most part
Totally.
now, everything we do with New Christendom Press and podcasting, most of that, none of that was happening through most of this. It's kind of that 10 years of fighting, building, plowing, planting, defending, and now we're in a season of reaping in the church where the fruit is coming in, and we have a school, and we have, just a church that's never been more like-minded and pushing the plow the same direction, running out of room. Like, just the Lord's blessed, and we're very thankful. It was a wild ride. I'm sure you can identify with a lot of the wildness of that journey.
Just a little bit. Yeah, just a little bit. Because we planted when I was 24, Matt was 26. And it was all Matt's fault, Matt's idea. I always blame him because it was his, like, he was in those Mark Driscoll Acts 29 circles. And I was just more like you, where I was like, I had led worship ministry in high school, at summer camp. I had worked at a summer camp. Kim and I wanted to go into summer camp ministry. We also wanted to go into missions. And Matt was like, what about church planting? And I was like, I don't know. Sure. Let's explore that. So I went to the mission field. That didn't work out because I was not a good missionary in an Islamic dictatorship. God did not design me for that. At least at this time. I still love missions. I mean, I love traveling and seeing other cultures. But then when we came back, we planted the well with Matt and a core team here in Boulder. But yeah, we were young and we hadn't been to seminary. Now I went to seminary. That was kind of like a big deal for me to, like, I wanted to go and like ask all the questions that I had growing up in the church that I didn't feel like I had good answers for. And then Matt was reluctant to go, but he went a little bit later than me, got his MA in leadership, which was one of the smaller degrees, but it's still a degree. Yeah. And he graduated in 2020, so he didn't get to walk, which was super disappointing because I'm so proud of him for doing that, because I'm more academically minded. It's more kind of like fun for me. And for Matt, it's more of a challenge. Brilliant guy. I mean, he really sells himself short, but yeah, so similar journey. I don't think as intense as yours, but similar journey. I guess one thing that I wanted to ask through these 10 years at Refuge, was there more training? Who was investing in you? What were you reading? How did that work in terms of you getting resourcement as you're continuing to kind of reform and refine and mature that church?
Yeah. So one of the dynamics about ministry in Utah, I think this is becoming true in many areas as well, and there's probably lots of other regions that can identify. But Utah is the only state in the union, as far as I'm aware, that was never in its history overwhelmingly Christian at any point. So from the beginning of the state's existence to now, it has never been largely Christian at all. I mean, I doubt it's broken 15%. It's been dominated by Mormonism. And in our area right now, that means that there's like 2 to 3% Protestant Christians at all, especially if you pull that data down to, like, do you attend a Protestant? Not just, are you generally vaguely Protestant?
Right.
Do you go to a Protestant church? It's like 2 in 100. So one of the things that means is that there is no Christian infrastructure in terms of culture, training, churches, nothing. If you want it to exist, you have to build it yourself or import it from somewhere else. So it also creates a dynamic amongst churches that's really insular, because you can tend, I think, to develop a competitive culture. When there's so few Christians for churches like to keep the lights on, it ends up being kind of like a very not great dynamic between churches in the area. So all of that really led to the cold, hard realities of stepping into ministry in our context, was that you just don't find many older, mature Christians. Don't find, we're a very transient community. The largest employer is the government, especially Hill Air Force Base. So people are moving in and out on 2 to 4 year basis. So for me, that meant I had to I did a distance Bible college for my bachelor's. And then after that, I just read everything that I could get my hands on. Couldn't find people, couldn't really find meaningful mentorship. There weren't older folks. So I was just reading everything I could get my hands on immediately. And that's one of the blessings of Calvary Chapel, is that here I am stepping into the pulpit, and it's, I've had some training and things like that, but it's like day one, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to preach verse by verse through a whole book of the Bible.
Right.
And that's dangerous because when you're a dispensational Arminian and you start preaching through, for me, it was just the book of Genesis. By the time I was done with Joseph, I was solidly a Calvinist. I was like, I'm sorry, they're just right. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. Like, God meant for all this stuff to happen to Joseph. That seems really sovereignty-ish to me.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, really preaching the Bible led the reformational dive, because it was, to do it well, I kept running into this, who do I read? And that kept driving me back to the Puritans and back to these great theologians from the Reformed tradition, because they're so biblical, they're bibline, and they're deeply rooted in the history of the church, but they're not falling into the errors of Roman Catholicism or what I would see in Orthodoxy. So, I mean, what else is there? Megachurch, attractional, kind of like Billy Graham-ish guys. Then there's these, revivalistic kind of guys, none of which, upon inspection, did I think were responsible, helpful exegetes. So it was Reformation theology, Reformed theology. And that was really the thing that led us into a journey towards confessionalism. And there was lots of moments along the way that only a Calvary Chapel guy can identify with, like the moment when I realized that I did not believe in a pre-tribulational rapture of the church. And then I was like, well, what do? I guess I guess I investigate historic premillennialism and read some, what's his name? Jim Hamilton. And, it all started though with preaching the text of Scripture, and then finding every other book that we could possibly locate and dig up on those topics.
That's great. When you are preparing a sermon, are there certain figures in church history or certain commentators, certain people you're like, I got to hear from this guy to kind of help as I do sermon prep? What commentaries are you using? What are resources you're going to regularly?
Yeah, I'm usually looking for a couple. I like to have a couple kinds of commentary or resource in front of me. I like to have something simple and old like Matthew Henry. A lot of Calvin's work is just pastoral. It's straightforward. It's meant for people and not scholars. Not that scholars aren't people, but are they?
Yeah. Are they though?
I like to have something like that. I do like to find, the best modern commentary, something written in the last 50 years, just to see what it's saying, what the people are reading, because that's going to be what people in the congregation are likely to be influenced by. And then I also like to identify themes or main topics in that book that are going to come up, and then read some books that are not commentaries on the book, but let's say you're preaching a Pauline epistle and you're going to be dealing with the household code. So I'm going to try to read or reread a few books on marriage, masculinity, femininity, parenting, education. And then I also like to have at least one deeply biblical theology type commentary. And, some of them recently have been stuff from Athanasius Press or the Theopolitan guys, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's great.
And I think that all kind of comes together to help you have a whole biblical theology of the book, a systematic theology of the book, an applicational pastoral theology of the book, exegetical theology of the book. That's at least my approach, I would say, most of the time.
Yeah, it's similar for me where Matthew Henry he's very held in low regard in academia, but once I started reading him in 2020 again, I was like, I mean, he seems right and he's pre-modern, and so I'm going to default to him. I'm going to try to find Augustine or John Chrysostom, and then do my modern stuff, and then dabble in James Jordan, Peter Leithart, Doug Wilson, and just trying to get a good picture of it. So yeah, that's helpful. One of the things I've encountered with a lot of pastors is that 2020 just was a catalyst moment, a gift from the Lord, in that it was like a revealing, and it kind of showed where a lot of fault lines were and what was going on. I guess, first of all, what was 2020 cataclysmic for your church? Was it like you were already ready to go? What was that experience like being a pastor of a church, Ogden, Utah? 2020 hits, you've got COVID, you got BLM. What was that like for y'all?
Yeah, 2020 was such a gift for us because it accelerated the leaving of some people that needed to leave, that
Yeah.
were not going to be on our team, that were not going to be pushing the plow the same direction, that were not going to respect or submit to the elders, that were not going to be winnable to anything close to the vision for the Christian life that we were going to be teaching, counseling, preaching towards, that we're deeply convinced is the biblical model for all these things. And so when 2020 hit and we were open very quick, I mean, there were a few weeks when no one knew what was happening, like, what is this?
Yeah.
Our governor said, we're going to ask people to do this, this, and this. And we initially said, okay, well, we think that's within his sphere. If there's a plague in the city, like, he can close commerce coming in, whatever. So we switched to some other things for a few weeks. But then pretty quickly, as we're realizing, we're going to be fine. Like, even if one or two of us die, that's fine. That could happen every flu season. So we started getting back together. We didn't do the mask thing, all of that. So many people, not many, but some percentage of the church did not ever come back. Some of them angrily, some of them, it was just the thing they needed to go, I'm really not on board with this, and haven't been for some time. And that was a gift. So we shrunk, and in a lot of states, if you were just open, you grew. And that's a blessing and a curse, because a lot of those churches that grew rapidly through COVID have a very difficult pastoral task in now enculturating all these new people, winning them to things other than just anti-mask, pro-Donald Trump type stuff, which is fine as far as it goes. We didn't have any of that, because there just is not transfer growth to be had in the state of Utah,
Right.
which again was a gift. At every step of the process of Reformation for us, one of the biggest gifts the Lord's given us is, because of our area and cost of living and things like that, we've grown, but it's protected us from growing rapidly. So only the last year have we experienced growth that's been like, okay, we actually need to do some building things, and we're definitely need to accelerate raising up elders so our parishes aren't too full. But 2020 for us was, I think, on the whole, a gift, in that it did help. It was this great opportunity for reset for people that needed to leave. And then out of that, since that period, we've never been more like-minded. The church is definitely now a congregation that respects their elders, that is wanting to follow and actually listen and hear them out. And even where there's disagreement, now the dynamic is different from a combative, like, even with the Calvinism thing, like, I'm never going to believe you, but go ahead and tell me why.
Sure.
You think this silly doctrine's true, to I don't understand why you would baptize a baby. Can you walk me through that? But hearing and respectful and open to the idea. So 2020 was an apocalypse for us, but it was 100% a gift as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of pastors have experience. I mean, Boulder's a similar context. The way you described it is almost perfectly matches our context as well, as far as, like, everyone's kind of talking about, if you take a stand, everybody's going to show up. And I'm like, first of all, we're not doing it so that everybody will show up. And second of all, that's just not happening here.
You don't
a lot of people think we're crazy. And we definitely we're trying to do it. And I think one of my things is, like, how do you do this stuff pastorally? Because these are people. Like, I'm imagining, Brian's not getting up every Sunday and going, like, I have an announcement. We are now Paedo Baptists. Thank you. And there's the door if you do not agree with me. So what did it look like for you to pastor people out of the church in some way, but also pastor people in maturity? Like, how did y'all navigate, hey, like, I've arrived at this conclusion, elders, are we in agreement? And then how did you roll that out? What did it look like to reform your church in that way?
Yeah, starting with the first one, with Calvinism at all. one of the first things I did was tell the elders, because we were a plurality of elders, not a Moses model church, which for Calvary Chapel was unusual, but we were a plurality of elders. So I told them, I'm convinced of this doctrine. Here's why. I feel like I can't preach in good conscience through books of the Bible like I'm supposed to, without just saying that this is what I'm teaching you guys. This is what I'm teaching the church. So we took about a year at that point, and the elders, I told them, I will resign. I'll go. I'll do whatever, make a living somewhere, and I'll resign because the church is not a Calvinist church, and that's fine. I know this is going to entail us leaving Calvary Chapel if we adopt it. The elders took about a year, and ultimately all but one of them ended up agreeing. This is actually correct. That elder even stayed on for several more years after that, continuing to pastor. We had a lot of conversations behind the scenes. Calvary Chapel doesn't have membership, so with members. And then slowly just began to teach and preach and be transparent with the congregation. This is what I believe. Here's why. Let me explain why I'm not telling you that if you don't agree that you're out today.
Right.
Christians can disagree about some of these things, but I want to be open with you. This is what I'm preaching from the pulpit. This is what you're hearing every week. So we've never had like all of a sudden with anything we did, everybody leaves the next day.
Right.
It's always like a long tail of pastoring people, sometimes telling them, look, your conscience clearly doesn't let you fellowship here. Go in peace. Here's a church that you might be at peace with. And I recognize that's difficult. For things like 4-part singing, where it was more of a big cultural move, where we moved from me leading worship with the guitar in unison, mainly unison, not harmony, to 4 parts and a piano with no amplification. That's a big change. And that, again, took us more than a year we established a Tuesday psalm sing. We didn't even start singing these on Sunday until we had probably 20 of them memorized. And like 60% of the congregation was really excited about it because they had experienced the beauty of the thing. So all of these things, Calvinism, singing in parts, which also came for us with adopting a much more traditionally reformed liturgy with kneeling and confession of sin and assurance of pardon and public reading of scripture, all of those things. They were all long, much work behind the scenes laid, and then they were all very much we're trying to win the people to them before we ever do anything publicly about this doctrine or practice. And that has definitely served well in unity, where the congregation, paedobaptism, I mean, we're a dual practice church, which is very highly unusual. And we recognize that. The majority of our church, according to a survey we just finished, is Credo Baptist. Maybe 30% are Paedobaptist. I think a good percentage is undecided, and then a majority is Credo Baptist. But it has not been a divisive thing in our church at all. We had a few families that were like, we're 1689 to the bottom, no exceptions, and we just can't do it. Like, that's fine. But they left in peace, went to 1689 confessional churches. And, the result has been that our church is very much the people. I think we've preached all of this is going to sound bad, but I'm going to call them the doctrinal autists. Maybe you've, the guys
Some
that
have
are
called
like,
me that, Brian.
yeah, that's what they think we are. But most pastors, well, at least our pastors are not like that. None of our pastors are like, man, my ideal day is just sitting down and for 8 to 12 hours reading, on scholasticism. It's just our guys are very much, we love theology, we love the scriptures, and but our main emphasis is pastoral theology. How does the scripture land in the lives and touch and make contact with the lives of the sheep? And then how do we help get them from where they are to the green pasture that we're trying to get them to for their good? How do we do that? So a lot of the way that our church works, it's not attractive to people who are like, come in and they have this one idea of this is the Platonic ideal of Protestant Christianity that is descended out of heaven. And it's usually some kind of weird conglomeration of 16. I'm Van Tillian and presuppositional. I'm Bonson theonomic. I'm a 1689 Reformed Baptist. And they have a huge list. Most of the time, we're trying to convince that guy, please don't come to our church. Please don't. Please, we are begging you, go to somewhere else.
Sure.
Because a lot of the time, that is the most schismatic and difficult to pastor person in the world.
Right.
So we don't have a lot of those folks in the church because they wouldn't have a good time. They would not enjoy it. But we do have a group of Christians who are very much on mission together to see the Christian faith touch every part of what it means to be human in all of the vocations of life.
Yep. When you think about these reformational efforts you've done, one of the things in ministry, a lot of times when you look at whether it's Refuge or other churches, especially in American culture, but I think just human culture, we want to look at people and paint a narrative or a story where well, they just did it the right way. They did it perfectly. No mistakes were ever made. And it can be tempting as a leader to kind of make it appear that way. But as I've tried to do on the show, at least on my show, I've even roasted one of my own articles on air that I wrote 6 years ago. That was showed favoritism towards BLM. And I just wanted to show people look, I missed it on this. So I guess my question to you would be, hey, what lessons did you learn through this process? If somebody who I have in mind is somebody's listening to Foolproof Theology, somebody may be listening to Hardman podcast, and they're like an elder at a church. They're not telling anyone they're listening to this stuff because they know it would upset people. But they're interested in doing reformational work. What are some pitfalls that they should avoid? What are some lessons they can learn from maybe your experience out at Refuge?
Yeah, don't be the guy that really believes or projects to believe that there are basically two groups in the world, idiots and people who agree with me. Because that, first of all, rhetorically, it's not effective. And I mean that particularly for pastoring people in your flesh and blood context. There is a time for sometimes in public facing a tweet or a podcast, I'm going to say something in a way that's actually about maybe another theological position. It's not actually intended to win that person. It's really intended to bolster my people against what I would view as an error. So that's a different voice that a shepherd is using. But when you're talking to your people, you need to be humble. You need to be sit down with people, be convinced, be courageous, be confident, but do hear them out. Do acknowledge, especially with change, that what you're doing is hard for them. Where I told people all the time, I get it, guys. You signed up for a Calvary chapel. And now I'm telling you that I'm a Calvinist. And that the elders are actually convinced of Calvinism. And that's how we're going to preach, teach, and counsel. That's hard. I get that. It's fair for you to have hurt or to have confusion. And so let me do my best to patiently, ironically walk you through the reasons for that, hoping to win you and win your heart to trust the elders, but also to the doctrine, and understand that not everybody is going to just come with you. And honestly, also recognizing that a lot of churches or many situations are not the type of situation where you should be attempting to reform a church, but are situations where you should leave, particularly if you're one elder on a team. And let's say you're not a preaching pastor, you're just you're the worship leader. Okay. And, or you help with youth ministers, something like that. And you've got this established church that for 50 years has been what it is.
Right.
It's probably not kind of you to try and say in 10 years from now, this church is going to be confessing the Westminster Confession of Faith. Right. It's not. I'm just letting you know, it's almost certainly not going to do that. You should only embark on reformation of a church on this scale, like the one that we experienced, if you are very much the entire leadership team, or virtually the entire leadership team is no, this is the correct direction. and the history of the church is taken into account. For ours, we were hardly a thing. We barely existed. And most of the people that had come were not dyed-in-the-wool third-generation Calvary Chapel people. Most of them were new converts at that time, or even new converts to the thing we were doing. And what they loved was expository preaching. And they weren't super, completely sold on every other element of it. That was a completely different starting point for us, where in many churches, had I gone through seminary in a tradition, joined a church, or been called to pastor a church, and then said, I've experienced a deep theological change. In most cases in that kind of church, you should step down.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's some cold water, I think, for a lot of guys. But the alternative is that a lot of the time you harm a lot of people unnecessarily, because you're actually not going to win in the end. You don't have strategic ground from which to really fight those battles, because they are very costly. So that's probably not encouraging, but
no, I mean,
clarity.
It's exactly what I'm thinking, because like I've told my elders, like I've been Baptist. I grew up Baptist. I have all my Presbyterian friends want me to, cross the Jordan, so they say. And, anyone who endorsed my book is Presbyterian besides one guy. So I've surrounded, I'm immersed in Presbyterian world. I was one breath away from going to Westminster, Philadelphia. And I told my elders, if I ever make that, I'm not saying it's impossible that in 10 years I wouldn't see that. I don't see it right now. I'm not convinced of it. But if I did, I would want to tender my resignation, because that's a significant deviation from what this church has been historically.
Yes.
I think dual practice is really interesting. But we at our church, we've always been willing to accept Presbyterians in full membership, so long as they can tell us, something that resembles the Westminster. Give us any kind of statement, or not even written down. Just tell us this is our conviction. Cool. Like then we'll count your baptism as valid but improper. And so that's always been our practice. So it's really not that big of a deal at our church. One thing with this is, as you're reforming, you're looking for other people to kind of join with. What's interesting about the Puritans, though, is that a lot of these guys, I mean, when you look at it, when they planted in New England, a lot of them were non-denominational, so to speak. They were kind of trying to make the Anglican Church envious, but they were planting churches in Massachusetts, Connecticut, other places that were Paedo-Baptist but non-denominational. And it's like, oh, that's refuge. So what has kept you guys from joining up with either a denomination or a network or anything like that?
Yeah. So we've been very, very slow about any kind of partnership on that level. One reason is because we did partner with a church planting network early on in my pastoral leadership of the church as the lead pastor, which was an offshoot of Acts 29, Sojourn Network, now Harbor Network. Loved a lot of the guys there, made some really good friends. Jared Sparks I connected with through that. And I think it had some good leadership at the time when we joined. We did that slowly too. But then very quickly after we joined, Mike Cosper became the president. They immediately began to do some obviously woke things. And so we left. And it was like the Simpsons guy who comes in and he takes his hat off and then he turns around and he puts his hat back on and he goes out the door. That's what it felt like. It was like less than a year and a half that we were in this thing. And it was through COVID that I can't even remember. Maybe it was through COVID. The timeline's fuzzy.
Yeah.
So we left that, and we've been very slow to join anything for a lot of reasons. But one of them is just the pace of change for our church has been a lot. And so we look in terms of the 500-year plan to the future, at minimum, would be to plant and particularize other churches local to us as we grow, not to build a huge building, but to plant and particularize and form a presbytery and regionally govern a body of like-minded churches who are just not inventing anything new, just saying like they've already come up with this, it's Presbyterianism. I'm just going to do that. We wouldn't be allowed in virtually any of the like very strictly confessional Presbyterian fellowships, PCA, OPC, that just wouldn't have us for lots of reasons. The CREC would, and we love the CREC and everything they're doing. But again, we're just being really slow about some of this. So long term, it's that at the minimum. And then if the Lord opens a providential door for us to join with somebody else doing other work, then we would as well. The CRAC is a really, really broad pond, and there are very distinct corners of the CRAC that have their own culture and theological emphasis. And I mean, that's just by virtue of having the breadth that they have in the confessional alignment that's permissible for a church. So some of that has kept us as well from pulling the trigger on saying, like, let's join the CRAC. Knox Presbytery that we'd be in, I'm 90% sure is very like the most like-minded corner of the CRAC with us. But then there are things that just we have emphasis on that the CRAC definitely does not have emphasis on, or is actively opposed to, like encouraging women to head cover. That's a very, very touchy topic in the CRAC. We found, not because we try to like proselytize CRACers to disobey their elders or anything, but
Right.
there are just some of those issues where we're genuinely not, completely aligned and don't want to cause a ruckus, at least the wrong ruckus.
I understand. Yeah. So
we're
ruckus, officially,
yes.
Yeah. By the time this episode airs, I mean, we're announcing it to our church. We're candidates in the CRAC.
That's awesome.
And so I think our perspective was we're eclectic. I would describe you guys as eclectic as well, but in a confessional sense. And yet I think there are different emphases in different areas. And so because we're 1689, Baptistic, and we're just relationally already connected with a lot of these guys, whether it's Trinity Church down here in Denver or other guys. When we visit with these older men that have gray hair, I have some. Matt has a lot more than me. But it's just nice to be around guys who are willing to be with us and they're not embarrassed by us. And I think that's been refreshing. Whereas our former affiliation, it was like we were always the fly in somebody's ointment. And that can be fun, once you just embrace it. Like, I'm showing up and I know you hate me and don't like me. So I'm going to lean into that and just love being here and be as loving and kind as I can. But when I go to these places, it's like very, very, I'm going to use the word tolerant, but, very like permissive in terms of like, hey, like we're working towards the same thing. Yeah. It's super unique. I mean, it's a broad, there's a lot of hate about Big Tent. But you've got Paedo Communion, Paedo Baptist, you've got very few Credo Baptists. We'd be one of the few, but just a willingness to work together, to encourage one another as we go through our own Reformation thing. Cause that's the thing for us is like, we don't want to do this alone. We've been doing it alone and felt like we haven't been resourced for a while. And it's like, well, I'm sure other people have done this before us, and maybe how could we sharpen one another? But I'm not interested in joining anything to like, oh, you're going to be a cool young church and maybe we can learn from you. I'm like, no. Like, that's not, I'm not here to be that guy. Like, I'm here to try to just learn how to be faithful over time. Not to push any envelopes. In fact, we want to be reformed and more like you guys. So we're going to be learning more from you. And we're very uninterested in either being platformed or like, anything like that. So I resonate with the slowness there, and I appreciate that. One of the things
so for the CRAC, like I love the CRAC. Pastor Toby Sumter is, he's such a helpful guy. I've called him several times, like, hey, help me out with this. Pastor Wilson, we wouldn't be here without those guys. We just would not exist. Like so many elements of the things that make our church what it is today are fruit on their branches. So yeah, definitely. That's exciting. I'm glad to hear that. That's exciting for you guys.
Yeah, it's fun stuff. So, it sounds like Calvinism for you. And I think every pastor in any kind of church or any church leader, whether you're a member at a church or whatever, if you've been finding yourself listening to outside sources, dissident literature and podcasts, and you're in a church, there's going to be certain things in any church that's going to be seen as possibly divisive or at least different than what that church believes. So for you guys, it sounds like Calvinism was the big one. For us as well, it was like teaching on masculinity and femininity. I mean, over the last 4 years, we've tried to do a big emphasis on that, not necessarily like intentionally, but just as we came across verses and when we saw cultural issues come up, This is the one I have on my podcast a lot. It causes some conversations in the church, good pastoral conversations. But we've always been Calvinists in our convictions, always been welcoming to people who are not Calvinists to come and worship with us. And so the topic of masculinity has been one for us. When we push into that area, it's like, oh, that's like a pressure point for a lot of people, especially in Boulder. It's a very feminist climate.
Yeah.
And so I guess, you interact in this space a lot. I see you tweet about it. Why do you think masculinity is so important for the church to emphasize today? What makes it both so offensive to some people, but what makes it so necessary to talk about?
Yeah. So much of what we've lost in the previous generations in revivalistic, decisionistic, megachurchianity, big, fast, and famous culture, what it boils down to often is minimalism. It's theological and cultural minimalism. What's the bare minimum you need to believe to be a Christian? Because in a post-Christian world, or in an increasingly post-Christian world, that's what we're trying to convince. That's our evangelistic front. At least that was the notion that people had. So how can we eliminate as many barriers in our church practice and in our doctrine so that anybody could come in and not be stumbled by something way down the line theologically, at least in their view? I think that's a wildly dangerous way to approach life, church, theology, and ministry, because you end up making people that are actually not willing to say, it's baked into your system, who are not willing to say, however far down this goes, I will go too. I will say Christ is Lord, not just on general theism and salvation by grace alone through faith alone. And then who cares about my living arrangement? Who cares about whether my wife works or my kids go to public school or any of these other things? What you end up doing is you create a very thin kind of Christianity that will not withstand the whole-souled, totalizing worldview of secular liberalism that you're competing with, because they're offering a total vision for what it means to be human. So pastors have to do that too. And one of the biggest arenas where that's going to practically matter is how you live out your sexed reality. Are you a man or a woman? And what particular duties from God come to you as a man and as a woman? And what you find is that the entire church has been pretty univocal on this, and that the scriptures are pretty univocal on this, that there are real duties there. And we've actually been doing a pretty poor job of them. And we've discovered that those who hate wisdom love death. So where we've rejected whole-souled masculinity and femininity, we've reaped the whirlwind of androgyny, death, cultural suicide, death of birth rates, abortion, fornication, all of these different sins that just take root in a society and lead to death. So for us from the very beginning, this has been one of those issues that our strategy has been, without apology, to teach the entire thing all up front. So when someone comes for a member interview, I just say, hey, we're post-millennial, patriarchal, we're all of these things, and we're going to unashamedly teach you that you shouldn't send your kids to the government schools, that your wife should not be, the breadwinner of the home. She should be a worker at home, that she needs to be submitting to her husband, that he needs to lead like Christ. We're going to do that right away, from the beginning all the way down to the bone. That's what we're going to be doing. And ironically, it's actually led to, it definitely filters people out quickly, but it's also led to, I can think of couples that came to the church from some circumstance or other, maybe listened to a few podcasts we did, whatever, showed up, moved here for a job. And then they started with the first dinner, at my house or something, like, hey, we're newly married. We're pretty skeptical of this. So we don't want to have kids right away. We want us time. And I'll just look them in the eye and say, that's dumb. You should start having kids because God says to. Yeah. And it's really awkward because sometimes I'll be like, oh, okay. And hopefully kindly and everything I said about Irenic and trying to win them. But I cannot tell you the number of, it's well over a dozen at this point, where within a month or two, they'll come back and they'll say, that's really stuck in my craw. And I was annoyed at first and kind of offended. And then we realized that we were wrong, and that this is one of those areas where the church is just wrong. And it's at the root of a lot of our wrongness. And so we're going to have kids, and my wife's going to quit her job. I'm like, good, cool. Lord
That's
bless you.
great.
You're going to
Yeah.
be happier in 5 years that you did that. So masculinity and femininity for us, the reason it comes up so much is because the culture is so wrong on it and they're discipling people in their wrongness. And B, it just is the arena that you're going to live out so much of your sanctification in the Christian life that it's a very natural applicational point of contact between the text and the people, often in preaching and counseling. And then counseling is the last one, that when we're counseling people, probably 80% of counseling a pastor does, at least in our context, is like marriage, parenting, kids, relational kind of stuff. And so you just have to become like a tradesman as a pastor today, have the competency of a tradesman in the trade of making men masculine and women feminine, or your church will really, I think, suffer from against the onslaught of the culture.
Yeah. One of the things I would ask on that topic with pastoring people through it, because I think early on at the well, and we still have this kind of temperament where it's like, we're going to give you the full thing right now. In our membership process, we do a similar thing. Like, we just lay it all out there so people can make a decision quicker.
Yeah.
But we also have a pastoral heart where it's like, we want people to come and be able to learn as well. We don't want to scare it. Like early on, we were like, this is what we are. If you're either in or out, and if you're not in, get out of here. Obviously wouldn't say it that way, but that was like what people sensed. And so if somebody comes to your church, meets with Pastor Brian, they are sending their kids to government schooling, wife is working, but they're still willing to be members at your church. Are these matters which rise to the level of church discipline for you guys, or are they like, how does that work pastorally?
Yeah. So barring providential hindrances, like let's say a man had a prior marriage before he was a Christian, had several children, his wife cheated on him and left him. Like, this is a situation in our church. And so he doesn't have full decision-making authority over his children with respect to education or something like that. Barring some providential hindrance, we would not bring somebody into membership in the church if their kids were not receiving a Christian education.
Okay.
Or if somebody were looking at pornography regularly, or some of these things. We bring all that up in the member interview, and if that's an issue, then we say, okay, you're not ready for membership right now, but we want to disciple you in this. So we're not saying fix everything. Like with pornography, it's like, stop looking at porn now and don't do it again. But we're going to help you, but you need to stop. We're going to try to convince you why. And the reason that we do that then, instead of allowing somebody to become a member with this really significant difference with us, is because what we're really testing for at that stage is, will you submit to the elders of this church when they tell you, thus saith the Lord? Like, will you actually, when we say from the pulpit, which we regularly do, okay, hey, Ephesians 6:4 in our day and age, combined with many other passages of Scripture, means that Christians are not normally or ordinarily free to send their children to the government schools for their education. That's our genuine position. And so we would discipline for it, and we would not receive somebody in membership for it. If somebody says, okay, we agree with that principle, we're about a year out financially from being able to do that, we'll absolutely submit to that. Please help us out. We'll help them. Let's try to make that quicker. Let's try to give you resources, whatever it is, to help you come into membership like that. So that sounds really wildly radical, I think, to a lot of people. But one thing we noticed the more we looked back through history with how the church dealt with membership, I mean, especially in the early church kind of era, you're a catechumen for a year before we'll baptize you. We want, there's some of these things with converts where we almost have to treat people coming into the church as converts to Christianity. Not that nobody comes in as a Christian, but I mean, we're going to make sure that you are not just saying I'm a Christian, but in every particular way in which the culture is demanding a pinch of incense to Caesar, we're just giving them the pinch of incense. So we want to see, we understand they've been discipled for a long time. There's many reasons that exists, and that might be many of them are genuine Christians, but we want to give them a thing right up front. Okay, this is a hard test. We're going to say, stop giving the pinch of incense there. And if they say, absolutely not, that's crazy, you guys are so legalistic, and that we say, this is definitely not going to be the church for you. You will not be at peace here.
Sure.
And you will come to resent the leadership of the church. So that's not on every issue, masculinity, obviously, not on like head. Obviously, we don't do that like head covering. We don't do that with like a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But there are key issues where we've identified like these are core issues that somebody should not be a member at our church if they're not in alignment.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's, I mean, if you're a listener and you go to the well, you know that on those particular issues, that's not how we approach it, but these are helpful like tests to go like, okay, like how are you pastoring people through? Because especially for people in Boulder, when we planted, I mean, Boulder's one of the most, besides Aspen, one of the most expensive cities. People have started a life here, have a mortgage with a home. And so we're talking about a long time horizon for a lot of these people that have been members. And so we're trying to, kind of like the way you approach the Calvinism issue, we're trying to approach this issue with prudence, with care, and also try to like explore what it looks like to start a Christian school in Boulder, because I'm on the board of one that's like 15 minutes outside of the town. And so I'm always inviting people to come join, put their kids in that school. And I think a lot of Christians in Boulder are hungry for Christian education, but there's so many obstacles. And so, at our church, this hasn't been something we've deterred people from membership for those reasons, but it's helpful to know like how you guys deal with it pastorally. One of the things before I let you go, I wanted to talk about was, when our church received some local press, some local hate, kind of a cancellation attempt. And it was wild. I mean, it was the first time I'd experienced something like that. To see articles come out in the local paper calling your church the Christian Taliban, that was something. And so I texted Eric Kahn out there at your church, and I was like, dude, what is this? And he just laughed. And I was like, man, this really sucks. And you're just laughing. It's like, I know he's laughing as a brother. He wasn't trying to make me feel bad or anything. But he's laughing because you guys have experiences. I mean, from what I can tell, like national news has like retweeted you, national reporters, whether it's NBC or other people, like people that other people know have come after your tweets. And so I guess my question is, when you're putting stuff out there, you're getting these cancellation attempts. What's the hope in that? Because I think for some people, they may look at you guys in Ogden or other people and they may say, they're just trying to build a platform. They're just trying to be famous or something like that. Like, what's your approach there? What's your heart behind it?
Yeah. It's not saying, let's get as many people to look at us as possible online. That's not the goal. The goal for us is to a few things. It's to raise a signal flag to say, we're here, and these are the key areas where the church has capitulated and where the culture is attacking. And so particularly right here, we're going to stand up and dance around on this issue and say, we believe this thing with our whole soul. Like we are so pro this particular thing, whether it's Christian education, Christian modesty, femininity, masculinity, education, a lot of these issues that are particularly under attack, wokeness, ethnic, schismatic, like aggressive BLM type wokeness. Those are areas where the church needs the pastor who is in a particular type of role in society to go out front and take a lot of heat. I'm convinced of this. Partly to provide cover for everybody under him, because not everybody has the luxury within Christian culture to do that. Not every father would be wise to go do that online. Because I don't think everybody's called to that level of frontline attack. Some would immediately lose their entire livelihood by doing something like that. So the pastors need to lead the charge in providing cover for some of these key issues. So that's one thing we're trying to do. Another thing we're trying to do is to strengthen those on the fence who are vulnerable to being discipled by the gods of the age, by to not give in to them, by mercilessly mocking and making fun of them and revealing how stupid they are. This is a pastoral duty. This is part of being a good shepherd, is saying things like, you idiots take one log and you carve a god out of it and worship it, and then you burn the other half of the log to cook your food. You're an idiot. Like, this is how the prophets talked. They were mercilessly mocking foolish idolatry in the culture. And it wasn't with the aim of winning the high priests of the pagan culture. They're not going to do that. It was to protect the people of God from that folly by revealing how silly it is, right? So it's like, a Christian pastor today might say, in the same hospital, you go to get a heart surgery to save your life and go to great lengths to preserve the function of this vital part of your body. And 3 doors down, they're cutting the genitals off of a 16-year-old that's perfectly healthy to align with their inner mental illness. And it's like, are you going to convince the doctor who's doing that surgery that, that you're right, I'm so dumb? Well,
Right.
no. But I do want the teenagers in my church and the young people in my church who are vulnerable to the propaganda of those false gods. I want them to have all of the allure of it stripped away.
Yep.
And also then to make them into idol mockers. So, because when you're mocking the idol, you're not likely to begin worshiping it. You're not very likely to begin worshiping it. So it's not just engagement farming. It's actually very intentional and thought out. My particular rule is that, and this should be everyone's rule really, but I won't tweet anything that I'm not willing within 24 hours to defend from the pulpit in front of my local church. Like,
right.
I just won't. And that does change sometimes. That's led me to go, you know what, this is not the issue for right now. But it's certainly been, we've had international and national media attempting to cancel us, all kinds of stuff. But the Lord has just turned it all on their head. Every time they try to do that, it just results in more blessing. Like, God loves to bless his people when they are attacked by the world. He just loves to do it.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, like, that's one of the things that I think people miss is like, they're like, I can't believe you would tweet that. And I'm like, bro, like, you could put my Twitter feed up in church. Not that I would. And I would feel no shame. Like,
not at all.
Not because, I mean, like, maybe there's prudence. Maybe my elders would advise me differently. My elders have full authority to tell me, text me and just say, hey, delete that tweet. No problem. I'm not married to these. Maybe it wasn't prudent at that time. But for me, particularly with like TGC, who's blocked me, or Christianity Today, or these other institutions, they're misleading the sheep. And I view it as my duty as a pastor to show the people that are either coming to our church or might come to our church, like, no, like, we're in complete disagreement on this matter. Because the other option is they're getting discipled by all these teachers and podcasts, and like, they're binging Matt Chandler sermons during the weekday, then they're coming to church on Sunday. And so it creates an incredible tension as a pastor, because you're trying to like hold it all together. And I was just like, I'm tired of trying to hold it all together. I'm just going to say what I think and where I'm at. And I might make some mistakes. That's totally legitimate. But it's not just to like build an audience or anything like that. It's actually a defensive posture to mock those gods, to call them out. And so I appreciate that pastoral heart in there. I think it's really important. And like you said, it's not for everybody. I think one of the things people get tripped up by is like, Chase, but if my lost neighbors saw your tweets, they would never come to church. Have you had that criticism, and how have you handled that?
Yeah, I have had that criticism. Even recently, a member of my own family, extended family, was hanging out with some of their family, and they were like, at every possible opportunity, they were trying to bring up that I am a literal Nazi, or like that I am as bad as Hitler, and just that they hated me, and no way I will ever come to Christianity if that's what it's like, and that kind of thing.
Sure.
And I always respond, you won't come to Christianity. It's not because of me. I'm just saying things that God says. You don't like God. You actually just don't like God. You hate God. And so I'm not going to try and be God's PR guy. I'm not going to try to market the thing for God and like, no, he wrote a book. If I'm standing on that book, then, and saying what he says and doing it with, of course, wisdom and like, even back to the membership thing with church or with schooling. In your context and where you're at in the life of the church, it's a totally different thing. And you need a pastor for your people and your context, where for us, it's like, I'm saying that to somebody and also saying, and we started a school that you don't even have to pay tuition at if you are a giving member of our church. Like there's an option right here. Not every church has that kind of option. Not every church is where we're at in the life stage on this particular issue. So you have to have fundamentally, all of this boils down to wisdom, which is knowing how to apply true principles in difficult and complex moral circumstances in faithfulness to your task that God has given you. Knowing that that's not the task of the guy next to you necessarily, and having charity for him. Wisdom is really going to come down to the bottom of this, where a foolish Christian, a foolish man with a Twitter account who's tweeting true things can be a very dangerous thing, and actually bring reproach on Christ and on his people. We don't want that. We need wisdom at the end of the day. And part of wisdom is being able to say, yeah, and if my elders text me and they say, no, delete that you say, yes, sir, and you delete it, and you ask them what they thought and talk about why and try not to step in it again. But wisdom is going to be at the bottom of a lot of this. And it's also going to be the reason why different men do different things in the battle, and that's actually a feature, not a bug. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
We should be like, yes, Chase is doing this in his context. And I don't know his context, and I'm not called to know his context, but I'm thankful that he's wise and he knows his context and is pastoring his people well there, and praying that the Lord would do the same here in our context.
Amen, brother. Yeah, this is really helpful. I think that last point is just it's such a pressing issue with the idol of evangelism in our church culture in America, where people are so afraid to say the truth and what God believes. And of course, as Pastor Wilson talks about, we want to push Christ to the margins of the paper, not how that sounds, but like you want to expand the lordship of Christ over every area of life and apply it fully, a full orb Christianity. And so I think this conversation has really hopefully helped and blessed some listeners to be able to at least imagine what that could be like, and maybe walk with some more wisdom and prudence. If people wanted to follow you, catch up with you, keep up with you, Brian, where should they go? Do you have I don't think you've written a book, but you have plenty of podcasts for people to listen to. So maybe plug some of those for some listeners.
Yeah, so we are in the early stages of book publishing at New Christendom Press, which you can find at newchristendompress.com. So I'll be writing for some books for our publishing house there. Right now, I do Bright Hearts podcast, the King's Hall podcast with Eric and Dan, Haunted Cosmos with Deacon Ben Garrett. I produce music, settings of the Psalms and original music, as well as settings of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. I'm through like question 32 so far out of 107, and pastor a church here in Ogden. A lot of that can be found at just my personal website, briansauve.com, BrianSauve.com. And all of the podcasts and music and things that I'm doing can be found there. Honestly, though, the best way to stay connected with what's happening is just to follow me on Twitter, Brian_Sauvé. And all that stuff's going to show up there as well. So follow along, and I'd love to be honored to be a presence in your car or your catechism time, or earbuds while you're setting PRs with your deadlift, listening to Psalm 144. Yes. Any of those scenarios, I'd be glad to be
any
there.
Possible scenario.
Not to get too specific.
Right.
But when you're pulling 405 for the first time.
Yeah, specifically that psalm, you're really gonna want to tune into that. That's excellent.
And thanks so much, Chase, for having me on. It was such a fun conversation with you, and I'm so encouraged always by what you guys are doing. And Lord bless you in it.
Yeah, you too, man. Thank you so much for coming on. This was great.
My pleasure.